All right. So, quickly, in case we have a power failure, the Gemara returns to the Mishnah. Both parts of the next section are cited in order to analyze them. If one says to his fellow, blind my eye, etc., cut off my hand, break my leg, and the fellow did so, the assailant is liable to pay for the damage. Even if the first person added, on condition that there will be no liability, the assailant is nevertheless liable. If one says to his fellow, tear my garment or break my jug, and the fellow did so, the damager is liable to pay for the damage. If, however, the owner added, on condition that there will be no liability, the damager is not liable for payment. Okay, so the first question that comes up, obviously, is Rav Asa Bar Kamma says to Rabba, what's the difference between the first part of the Mishnah and the last part? What? It's the victim's explicit stipulation of non-liability effective when speaking about damaging his property, but not when speaking about damaging his body. Meaning that the typical thing of it is you're liable in both cases. But even if the person whose body says he must be harmed and he will give you no liability, we have to ignore it in that case, and there is liability. But with regards to his property, if he says you can damage it and there's no liability, there's no liability. Unless he makes a claim there's no liability, you're liable for damaging property. But in all cases, whether he says you're liable or not, with regards to one's personal injury, there's always liability. Okay, and the distinction is obvious. We're going to examine a few reasons. Rava said to Rav Asi Bar Kamma, in the first part, the case of bodily damage, the stipulation is not effective because a person does not forgive damage to the tips of his limbs, no matter what he says. So obviously, according to the Rashba, when somebody says blind my eye or break my leg, nobody in their right mind says that, according to the Rashba. So are they speaking out of mental illness, anger, or anguish? In other words, I'll give you a perfect analogy. Two people are driving on Modderfontein Road, and they get into an altercation where both of them get out, and the one guy says to him, I'm going to donor you. He says, yeah, hit me, I dare you. Boom. There's a problem. He's not asking him to hit him. Or if we put it according to our case of the Gemara, he says, I'm going to hit you. He says, yeah, and if you hit me, there's no liability. Don't worry about it. Nobody's going to sue you. Is he being genuine there, guys? No, he's being sarcastic.
No.
So exactly, if he says it out of anger, he says, yeah, of course you can get away with it. We don't believe him. Because somebody could say it out of anguish, mental anguish, saying, you know what, just my life's not worthwhile anymore, kill me. And don't worry, I won't hold you liable. I don't have the courage to do it myself. What do you think is going to happen in Shemaim or court of law? Are they going to say, no, you're not liable because the guy gave you permission? So the first thing of it is we cannot judge the person's state of mind because no one in their sane mind, according to Rabba's opinion to Rabba Asi Bar Kamma, that somebody would forgive the damage to his limbs, no matter what he says, because it's coming from a place of anxiousness or anger. So Rav Asi Bar Kamma said to Rabba, but by the same logic, would a person forgive his pain caused by an injury? Obviously not. So we know that there's a stipulation to that effect that's valid. Why? Because, guys, we see a contradicting brisa that if one says to his fellow, hit me or strike me, adding, on condition that there will be no liability, the assailant is not liable. So apparently from this brisa, a person's stipulation of non-liability should be taken seriously, even if it concerns physical pain. So what we see here is a contradiction between our Mishnah and this brisa brought. Now, the Gemara records Rabba's response. He was silent. He didn't say anything. And then Rabba was thinking about it. He said, look, he said to Rav Asi Bar Kamma, did you hear anything about this issue? Because he actually didn't know what to say to him with this contradicting brisa and Mishnah. So Rav Asi Bar Kamma replied to him. He said, look, this is what, and we're going to learn different opinions here. This is what Rav Sheshes said. The assailant is liable for bodily injury, even though the victim exempted him. Why? Because blinding an eye, etc., results in both a disgrace for the victim's family and the victim has no right to waive that. So what are we talking about a disgrace? Is that at the end of the day, a person can waive liability for the pain of being stricken, since it doesn't involve a disgrace to the family. Okay, so in other words, we're talking there about the pain aspect. So that you can waive it. Why? Because it's pain. A person feels it. But here we're talking about a case of permanent physical damage, permanent, like maiming, etc. And you can't exempt the assailant from liability in that case. Why? Because there's a verse in Deuteronomy chapter 25, verse 3, which says, 40 lashes shall he strike him, he shall not add. Meaning that at the end of the day, you're still forbidden to strike the victim in any way, because basically what happens now if you maim the person? The family suffers embarrassment because they might have to ask for tzedakah, because you've actually debilitated the ability of the breadwinner. Well, you certainly have affected the family with embarrassment. And we learned, guys, in Sanhedrin, this was before Gavin joined in Mahosha, that can a person waive their right to a funeral eulogy? And the argument is, well, is it for their honor? If it's for their honor, they can waive it. If it's for the honor of the family, that the member of the family is given kavod, it's not his to waive, because it's the family's honor. So to hear, the family doesn't want him to get hurt. It's embarrassing for them. They might rely on tzedakah. They might need permanent maiming and medical bills, even if he says it's fine. So we cannot do that. And that's according to Rav Sheshes. So now there's a three-way dispute on this point. So you've got three opinions now based on that. You've got Rav Oshia, who said, listen, the stipulation of non-liability for blinding, etc., it's not effective, because there's a disgrace to the victim's family that the victim cannot waive. So in other words, Rav Oshia is holding the same way as Rav Sheshes. Rav has got a different opinion. It's not effective because a person does not forgive damage to the tips of his limbs, regardless of what he says, which goes back to that issue of saying, look, at the end of the day, Rava rejects Rav Asi Bar Kamma's premise that waiving liability for physical pain is like waiving liability for physical damage. Rava maintains that a person would intend seriously to waive liability for pain. In other words, he might be a person that feels he deserves pain because he's done wrong, and it's a form of kapora. He might be mentally ill, but not for permanent maiming. Why? I'll tell you why. Somebody could end up killing another person in sheer temper when he sees that this other male individual is sleeping with his wife and having adultery, because it's a moment of madness. But the thing of it is, he might regret it for the rest of his life that he took a life of another Jew. Do you get what I'm saying? Even if he doesn't get the death penalty because there weren't witnesses, etc. So a person can be in a temporary state where they allow for the pain, and they're prepared to suffer the pain for whatever reason. Maybe there's an altercation between the two of them, and the one person says, listen, I did wrong to you. Now, I want you to cause me pain as a way that I can make it back to you, so that I can feel what I did to you. I'm just giving you a crazy scenario. But permanent disability, somebody's not going to waive, because if every day of their life they're going to have to manage with this disability, okay, then they're going to come to resent the decision and not forgive the assailant for permanently damaging the limbs. So that's Rava's saying that even if you forgive the pain, you can't forgive the permanent maiming. That's according to Rashi's opinion of Rava. Now, there's another opinion after that. There's an opinion of Rav Yochanan, who says a person's stipulations of non-liability could be effective for any kind of damage, even permanent injury. So he's saying, Rav Yochanan, it's possible that apart from the pain, for even permanent injury. However, a person's spoken stipulation can't be taken at face value. Why? There's a yes that is like a no, and there's a no that's like a yes. So the ruling in our Mishnah depends on the way the victim waived liability. So here we're not talking about state of mind. We're actually talking about tonality. So the victim tonality is taken into account according to Rav Yochanan. So the Gemara cites a brisa in support of Rav Yochanan's interpretation, because it was also taught in a brisa, if one says to his fellow, strike me or wound me, and the other person asks, can I do so on the condition that there be no liability? And he replies to him sarcastically, yes. That is the case of a yes that is like a no, because the tone is clearly the fact that it's not a unequivocal yes. Okay? If, however, one says to his fellow, tear my garment, and the other person says, can I do so on condition that there will be no liability? And he replied to him, no, sarcastically, that's a case of a no that is like a yes. So I just want to add a little bit of clarity to what we mean here. Is that it could be, you see, Rav Yochanan reads the Mishnah a little bit differently. Previously we thought that the victim stated that the invitation to injure him and the stipulation was in one complete sentence. Okay. Now, guys, we learned a concept before about testimony, about what happens when you do it in one sentence compared to pausing it, or you come back and give testimony in two different junctions. You remember that, Gav?
Yeah.
So we're saying here is up until now, if you look at Rava or you look at Rav Sheshes, or you look at the Rabbah and Rav Asi Bava Kamma, you're discussing things about that it was said in one statement. In other words, the statement was cut off my hand on condition that there will be no liability. So then there's nothing to talk about, because that's, let's just say there's no bad tone to it, there's no sarcasm, there's no mental illness, that the person seems rational. That's not what Rav Yochanan is saying. He's saying, look, firstly, you've got to understand the phrase wasn't in one sentence. The phrase was cut off my hand. And then the assailant asked, well, actually, can I do so on condition that there'll be no liability? And then the victim answered yes, in a tone of wonderment. Do you really think that you would be exempt? That's the tone of wonderment, right? So the Mishnah teaches that this yes is really a no, and if the assailant does cut off his hand, he's fully liable. So in other words, we're saying a case where, let's say two guys get out the car and they're having a verbal argument at that stage. And he said, you nearly rode me off the road. And the guy said, well, you drove like an idiot. He says, well, why don't, since you wanted to ride me off with your car, why don't you continue this basis and assault me? Then the person in the other car said, okay, I don't have any issue with that. I don't particularly like you. Do you waiver any liability of suing me if I assault you? He says, oh, sure, I waive liability. Of course, I'm not going to sue you. Now, that tone implies sarcasm. That's not a lack of sanity. That's an absolute sane tone of saying, what do you mean waive liability? It's not going to happen. And so, too, that the same statement is with regards to a pot. You say, oh, this is a Ming vase. That's worth R1 million in my family dynasty. Why don't you just kick it over and break it, since you're such a klutz and you've had 3 beers? And the other guy turns around and says, you mean I can break your R1 million heirloom? And he says, yes, you can break my R1 million heirloom. Now that is obviously a body language of saying, what are you, nuts? So there we learn it. Now, why do we learn this issue of Rav Yochanan, where it talks about bodily damage first, and then it talks about property damage? Because somebody is more likely to waive their rights in terms of property damage as opposed to physical damage. People generally don't like pain, and nobody likes permanent maiming. Although they might have something that they say, listen, I got a car, it's insured. Make sure you look after it and keep it safe. We're going to hit this next part of the thing. Like my Merc that's got a gearbox that's half on its way out. I'm saying, look after it. Make sure nothing happens to the car in Berea Yovel. Look after the car, So there clearly you're dealing with a tone of sarcasm. I mean, I had to laugh because I saw a Bill Burr thing about women who that afterwards they've got to claim that men stare rape her. You know what I mean? Now women are confusing a guy looking at a woman that's dressed like a slut, and basically they say she's been stare raped. In fact, she caused it by the fact that she dressed with half her assets hanging out, etc. Didn't dress modestly. He said, but at the end of the day, she turned around to him and they were skylarking. And he turned around and he touched her gently on the shoulder and she touched him. And then he tickled her and she says, no, I don't want to be tickled. I don't want to be tickled, like, meaning there's a difference between like a yes, I want to play around with your tone and a non-play around with your tone. And he says, you've got to be so careful today. That's what I like about that comedian. Sometimes you can hear truth in comedic style where people actually hear the Musa, by the way. So the next part of our Mishnah that we're dealing with is as follows. It says here, look, if one says to his fellow, break my jug or tear my garment, and the fellow did so, he's liable to pay for the damage. So we're going to contrast that with the following brisa, which states, guys, if one is exempt, if authorized to tear someone else's garment. Now, we're not talking about a case if you authorize somebody to tear somebody else's property. We know that's prohibited because of why? Because you can't be an agent through transgression. And if you don't own the article, you can never give permission to damage somebody else's article. But the Gemara is saying, well, what happens if somebody authorized you to tear their garment? In other words, the Torah says regarding custodians, if a man shall give money or vessels to his fellow to safeguard but not to lose, the laws of custodianship apply only if the owner gives the article to the custodian to safeguard but not to lose it, or to safeguard it but not to tear it. But if the owner gives the article to the custodian for the purpose of losing it or tearing it, then that so-called custodian is not a custodian at all, and none of the responsibilities of the custodian apply to him. So he's exempt if he does lose or tear the article. So what are we using? An example. The only example that I can give you is the fact that my car's gearbox is on the way out, and if I give it to Gavin and say to Gavin, listen, Gavin, I want you to look after it properly and to go do shopping in the middle of Hillbrow, okay, and to leave it there with the keys in the car, and you're the custodian. So if anything has to happen, you just give a statement, but you looked after it. It's beyond your control. What message am I giving to Gavin, guys? Get the car stolen. Get the car stolen.
Get rid of the milk.
Yes, in other words, he's no custodian at all. He's a partner in my theft or my fraud or whatever it is.
I'm part of your crime, man.
You're part of my crime, man. So
100%.
That's exactly the case. Now, all of these cases.
But I'll phone the insurance company before I phone you, just to let them know the car's been stolen. I think I just want to get that into motion as quickly as possible. All right, carry on.
So, listen, the one thing that's bothering me about these three opinions, which we're going to go through soon, is that before we go to this, so it's not a custodian at all. But I just want to go back to a previous point, okay? Is that, in summary, I just want you guys to know that Rav Oshia and Rav Sheshes are, like there are three views regarding waiving of liability for personal injury. Okay, on the one hand, you've got personal injury, and then you've got property damage on the other. So here we're just talking about personal injury. Before we get to this case of the false custodian, just in summary, Rav Osher and Rav Sheshes, they share the same opinion, because they say a person can never fully waive liability for permanent bodily injury, because such maiming is a disgrace to the entire family, and it could affect the earnings and the embarrassment, and he's got no right to waive his family's honor or put them in jeopardy. So, and also because the family would have emotional pain at him being injured. So a person can waive liability for property damage freely, and he can also waive liability for physical pain, but not permanent disability because of how it's going to affect the family. You must remember, if this guy ends up like Christopher Reeve in a wheelchair, somebody's got to look after him. And I'm sure adult diapers are not something the kids are looking forward to. Okay? To change for him. So apart from the breadwinning aspect. Now, Rav has got an issue, and he says, listen, a person can never waive liability for permanent personal injury, no matter what he says. Because if a person uses exactly the same terms of exemption, both in regard to cutting off his hand or tearing his garment, the assailant is liable for injuring him and exempt him for damaging to his clothes. So, guys, although a person never waives liability for permanent injury, he could waive liability for the pain arising from temporary injury. But the assailant, either way, is not permitted to strike him in any event. Meaning, what the assailant should know is, Hashem's going to hold him responsible, because the Torah says with that verse of Deuteronomy, you can't lash a person more than you have to. And therefore, it's not your body, it's Hashem's body. So it's not allowed. But we're talking about prosecution in the human court, not being held divinely responsible upon a person's death for the injuries that caused another. We're talking about legal cases of being able to get money out of suing somebody. So that's what you've got to bear in mind. There's no hechsher to allow it. We're just saying, well, could that be the case? Rav Yochanan said a person could waive both permanent injury and property damage, but the meaning of the waiver is defined by the tone the victim said it in. And it's also the way he said it. So if he made a complete stipulation of non-liability, in other words, in the same tone, he says in one sentence, cut off my hand on condition that you will not be liable. He's taken at his word. Okay? It's no liability. Now, it's not saying that Hashem would not hold both the assailant and the victim responsible for breaking his law, that you're not allowed to injure another person, but there's no court case there. But if there's a pause between the instructing of cutting off of his hand, guys, with the person asking if there's liability and in a sarcastic tone, we can't hold that at value. Now, accordingly, Rabbah is having a different opinion and saying, look, you can't trust that somebody's state of mind if they want to have personal injury or pain, because they're either saying it in a state of anger or they're saying it in a state of mental illness. But overriding all these comments, I would like to see how they answer Hashem's instruction to us that we're not allowed to harm our body. So the only thing I can think of is that Hashem will hold us responsible for giving instructions to other people to harm us, and for that assailant for having done that to his victim in Shema. But this is just a legal case. So now we obviously going on to this case that a custodian that is ordered to tear or break somebody's articles or property is not a custodian at all. Especially, we talk about a custodian, not of the body, because there's no such thing as a custodian of the body. We're talking about a custodian of articles. So if you say to him, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, look after my thing, make it disappear, cough, cough, wink, wink. As Gavin said, he would report me to the insurance company. So I wouldn't ask Gavin. Okay. Now, guys, there's an interesting thing.
Why you would.
We've got 10 minutes. I think we'll be able to finish the chapter. Let me just do that, and then we're done. So quickly. Furthermore, the owner must give the article to safeguard, but not to distribute to the poor. In any case, we see that if the owner of the article gives it to somebody to tear, then that person is exempt if he tears it. Why does our Mishnah say that if someone tells his fellow, tear my garment, the fellow is liable if he does so? Rav Huna says there's no difficulty. Our Mishnah and the Bryce are speaking of where the owner of the garment gave it to someone with instructions to safeguard it and to tear it. Our Mishnah is teaching you something different, where the garment came to the custodian's hand before the owner authorized him to tear it. Okay? So then the custodian is liable to tear it. Why? Because if it comes into your hand and the guy was seriously wanting you to look after it, and afterwards he says, I've changed my mind, I want you to destroy it, we cannot believe him. Because in that particular case, the custodian is liable because he was really told originally to look after it, and he shouldn't tear it because he will be held liable. In the Bryce's case, we're talking about a different case where the guy was, inverted commas, told to be a custodian, but really to damage the article. Now, this case of the poor is when a person hands over money to be distributed to the poor, and the guy says, listen, give it to tzedakah in the amounts and to the institution you want. And the guy ends up leaving it in the boot of his car, and his car gets stolen. So he's not liable. And the reason why he's not liable in that case is because the owner of the original tzedakah funds has given it to a agent or a custodian to distribute it the way he wants, meaning he can choose the tzedakah, and there's not one poor person that can furnish against him a legal case. Because remember, in a legal case, you need a plaintiff and a defendant. So the minute a plaintiff is coming, a poor person is saying, listen, I saw the car getting stolen. That was money for the poor. I'm poor, and therefore you can give the money to me. The plaintiff can turn around and say, well, I intended to give it to another poor person, not to you. And then the claimant hasn't got a claim, because how does he know the mindset of the custodian? Do you get what I'm saying? So that's the problem. And the original owner gave it over to the custodian. Now, the custodian is only liable if you have to look after it for that person. So if Kevin is going back to Israel but wants me to look after something in South Africa for him, he's given me the responsibility to look after it. So Kevin has got a claim against me because he's the plaintiff and I'm the defendant. But if he gives me money and says, distribute it to the charity you want in the way you want, he's now giving ownership over to me to distribute to the poor. In other words, he can't have a claim now because it's not his, it belongs to the poor. And therefore we're stuck in a position because no poor person can claim it from me if I let it get stolen, because I never stipulated which poor person it goes to, so there's no plaintiff in that case. And furthermore, there's no specific amounts that were issued. So it remains in no man's land, the case. Okay, so therefore you've got to bear that in mind. And also the Bryce is saying, if you give it to somebody with the intention of a custodian where you wanted to make it disappear, that's not a legitimate case of custodianship. Our Mishnah is talking about where it was first given with proper intent to a custodian, and then the original owner of the article says you can destroy it, and we're saying don't believe it, because the custodian, or even if he waives liability of the property, he could be liable. But we've also learned an opinion that if he says he's asked about the liability, the person in our Mishnah says, well, can I tear it? Am I understanding you correctly? And there's no sarcastic tone, etc. At that point, he's not liable for destruction. But he can't just, when the guy says tear it, tear it. He has to say the word tear it or damage it, and there will be no liability. It's not just an instruction to tear, it's a wavering of liability. Okay? Then quickly, let's go to another thing, and we nearly finished the chapter. Okay. So Rabba says to Rav Huna, this phrase, if a man shall give to his fellow to safeguard, implies that the verse is speaking only of cases in which the article has already come to the hand before he was given instructions. Nevertheless, the verse excludes him from liability if the owner told him to tear it. Okay, so the Gemara is basically saying that at the end of the day, Rabba says to Rav Huna, okay, look, I understand, because Rav Huna is saying, look, there's no difficulty. Our Bryce is talking about a person that hired a custodian, asked a unpaid custodian to look after something with the intent to get rid of it. And the Mishnah is speaking of where he asked him to genuinely look after it and said to me, you can destroy it afterwards when he changed his mind, but never waived responsibility. So the Mishnah is responsible. Rabba says to Rav Huna, he rejects the answer, says, if a man shall give to his fellow to safeguard, it implies the verse is speaking only in cases where the article has already come to the hand before he was given instructions. Nevertheless, the verse excludes him from liability if the owner told him to tear it. So Rabba says to Rav Huna, I don't agree. The minute you hand over an article, you've given it to the custodian with instructions to take care of it. So if you're just looking at an article and say destroy it, there was no handover. So I don't particularly agree. So Rabba said, look, the Mishnah and the Bryce refer to cases in which the garment had already, both of them, come to the hand of the custodian. But there's still no difficulty. So the only thing that Rabba says to Rav Huna is we have to be talking about the same thing. If the Bryce is talking about just pointing with the eyes, we're not dealing with that. We're talking about a case of actual custodianship. But there's still no difficulty, because our Mishnah refers to where it originally came to his hand for the sake of safekeeping, and the owner reconsidered, okay, and then authorized the custodian to tear it. So if the custodian does it, he's liable. So the brisa refers to where it originally came to his hand for the sake of tearing, and that's why it's exempt from tearing it, meaning you hand it over and you say, get rid of it. And do you get what I'm saying? Now, guys, we've got 3 minutes left, and then we finished the entire chapter. I don't want to cut Kevin out. I don't mind sending a new link. Let me just quickly go through this, and we're done with the entire chapter. So there's a certain purse full of charity money that once arrived in Pumbedisa. And Rav Yosef said that the treasurer for a community charity deposited with a certain person to be distributed among the paupers of Pumbedisa. So the custodian acted negligently. Why? Because thieves came and stole the money. So Rav Yosef obligated the custodian to pay. But a buyer says to him, look, there's a problem because Rav Yosef said that he's obligated to pay, but we learned, guys, in the brisa to safeguard but not to distribute in the poor. Meaning a custodian of charity funds can't be held liable for his negligence. Why? Because the minute you give it over to somebody and say, give it to the charity of your choice in the way that you see fit, you can't have a claim because it's not your money. You've handed it over to the custodian. You're not asking him to look after your article. There's no poor person that can individually make a claim because you can say, I had in mind another poor person. So this is a biased argument to Rav Yosef. So Rav Yosef said to a buyer, our case is different. The paupers, the poor people of Pumbedisa are given fixed stipends every week. So the monies are being held for specific people and in specific amounts. Now, when there's specific paupers and there's specific amounts, there's rules. They're governed by custodianship because you were given instructions whom to give it over and in what amount. So that person and all the poor can say, yes, we have a claim for this amount and you were owing us the money because we were the recipients of the tzedakah. It's not vague. We know the amounts and we know who was meant to get the money. So there is a plaintiff in this case. Okay, now I want Kevin to teach us how we're going to do this. We're done on the show. We finished the chapter, guys. We finished the chapter.
Scott, well done. Well done.
Okay, so we finished chapter 8. We actually finished chapter 8, the whole of chapter 8.
Scott, well done, everyone.
Kev, how do we get you to teach us? Kevin.
How much time do you have? I can't see it on the clock here. But,
no. Just
okay,
talk to us.
Okay, just an idea here. Okay, so in short, I was in the Mammoth Shabbos, and unfortunately, I couldn't see the king of Shiro. So anyway, so at the shul, in the Pasha up to today of Vayera, it talks about Abraham preparing a feast for these for the angels, for the guests, but it actually specifies it. There was butter, there was milk, and there was beef.